So I've spent the last week living with these three men, Abraham Lincoln, Charles Darwin, and Frederick Douglass. Not bad company, really. I read and I listened to their words, and I read what other people wrote about them and their lives. And I've wrestled with what these men's lives and works have to teach us about how to live our lives today. Now, why these three? Because they all celebrated their birthdays, the anniversary of their birthdays this week. I've been somewhat fascinated by the fact that both Lincoln and Darwin were born on the very same day, February 12th, 1809. To think that two people who had such immense contributions to our world both came on the same day into the world. And in fact, I came across a wonderful article about these two, Lincoln and Darwin, that was written by All Souls member Cenk Jones in his most recent book, published in 2012, titled Looking Back, Writings by a Veteran Newsman. And then, later in the week, after I posted this, Tamara brought me her sermon from 2009 that she had written on these two men, Lincoln and Darwin, on the 200th anniversary of their birthdays. So I really appreciated that. It was a fine sermon, and I thought, by this point I was not feeling very original, so I thought I would add Douglass into the mix, because he was born just a few years and a few days after these others on the same week, and his life and his story bring an interesting juxtaposition to these other towering figures. You see, Darwin was born into wealth and luxury, Lincoln was born into poverty, and Douglass was born into slavery. Luxury, poverty, slavery. Three very different sets of circumstances. Now, growing up, Darwin had every opportunity for education before him. Lincoln had very few opportunities for any formal education, and of course, for Douglass, all opportunities for education were illegal. And yet, they all accomplished remarkable things, and what they accomplished still impacts our lives today, right here. Now, it's so easy, I realize, to excuse ourselves and disqualify ourselves from doing anything of significance. People say, I can't do much because I don't have a lot of money like some of these other people. Or, I don't have the access to great schools, or a degree from a top-tier university. We might wrestle with depression, or not have a supportive family, or we may have suffered a devastating loss or a death which can make us feel that we're somehow worse off than most other people, and it can become an excuse. Any of these things can become an excuse for not working hard or accomplishing much. Now, one of the things that all three of these men had in common is that all of them lost their mothers when they were children. Lincoln lost his mother when he was 9, Darwin's mother died when he was 8, and Douglass's mother died when he was 7. Lincoln, we know, suffered from clinical depression. Lincoln also lost his first sweetheart just before they were engaged, and that was a huge loss for him. And then he lost 2 of his children while he was still alive. Douglass witnessed incredible abuse and was subjected to incredible physical and psychological abuse. Douglass's entire family was taken away from him at a young age, and due to the incredible racism, he was told that he was less than human by all the adults and by the culture that was all around him, and he was treated like property. Both Lincoln and Darwin were considered failures at a young age and told that by the people who cared about them. And all of these men were targets of bitter attacks because of their, and they drew the wrath of the traditional religious people because of their unorthodox religious views. Darwin, by the way, was part of a long line of Unitarians on his mother's side, and he attended a Unitarian church growing up. We know what that can be like, some of us. When you put it all together, you realize that these men suffered just about every conceivable type of ailment and abuse and bad break that exists. Or at least we can say they faced an enormous amount of what we call today issues. They had some issues that they had to grapple with. They remind us that no matter what we've been through, we should not count ourselves out regarding doing something of significance during our short time upon this earth, between the womb and the tomb. Darwin was not a particularly focused or ambitious student in school. As Jenk Jones recounts, Darwin was described as a person with courage and horse sense. He saw things that didn't fit with the theories of the day. And his willingness to go beyond the conventional thinking of his times was one of the most important ingredients to his success and discovery. And it's the same for Douglass. The conventional wisdom of his time told him that he was not a man, and that he was not and could never be equal to a white man. And in fact, once he became free and he became a respected leader for freedom and equality, he became a major proponent of women's rights in America, because women at that time were also told that they could not be equal to men. And he disagreed passionately about that too. He was a keynote speaker at the seminal Seneca Falls Women's Conference in 1848 that was referenced in this year's presidential inauguration speech. The president said, "We the people declare today that the most evident of truths, that all of us are created equal, is the star that guides us still, just as it guided our forebears through Seneca Falls, Selma, and Stonewall." Long before Martin Luther King said it, Douglass proclaimed that our individual freedom is inextricably bound to the freedom of every soul on earth. Black and white, male and female, every soul, all souls. This was certainly not the conventional wisdom of the times, and yet it was, however, a higher truth. Now, Lincoln, it seems, had a little bit of a harder time freeing himself from the conventional thinking of his times, and I'm sure that this had a lot to do with being a politician and also having to win elections. So, I mean, here we go. Did you know that Lincoln didn't come into office as the great emancipator or even with a commitment to freeing the slaves? In August of 1862, a year and a half after he became president, Lincoln wrote to Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, and he said, "My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it." He went on to say, "If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could free it by saving some and leaving others alone, I would do that." For a long time, Lincoln did not think that black and white people could live together as equals in this country. For a long time, he considered the popular idea of colonization, which was the proposal that the best solution if slavery were to end was to send former slaves back to Africa, because America could never be a nation of both black and white citizens living together equally. Now, of course, 6 months after writing that letter to the New York Tribune, Lincoln had written and signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which, by the way, only freed the slaves in the South, which he did not have control over. But it did not free the slaves in the North, which he did have control over. William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, pointed out this irony at the time by saying, "We show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves where we cannot reach them, and by holding them in bondage where we can set them free." Now, I share this morning to highlight that the moral evolution of a person whose speeches and writings have inspired people seeking freedom all over the world, the man who preserved and helped define self-government, and who was instrumental in helping end the inhumanity of slavery. Lincoln, like Darwin and Douglass, in their own ways, all succeeded and all changed the world we know by seeing past the conventional wisdom of their times and discovering a higher truth. But Lincoln's story in particular shows us that this process of seeing beyond our times, seeing beyond what everyone else is saying and thinking around us and the norms of our society, is often an evolutionary process. Even the most generous among us do not come into the world fully formed about our views with regard to other people, with regard to our biases and prejudices. We pick them up throughout our time. So as I read about Lincoln and his humanity, I came to see some of my own struggles to let go of certain prejudices and how challenging and humbling and sometimes even embarrassing it has been. When I think of how I've wrestled over the years with my own attitudes about, attitudes that were anti-Semitic, homophobic, Islamophobic, Eurocentric, sexist. I could go on, but I'm just going to work from a short list this morning. I mean, I'm not proud of it, but I'd also be lying if I didn't say that even to this day, I'm sometimes surprised on occasion when some prejudiced thought just pops into my head, and I think, my gosh, it's amazing that I would think that in this moment. At least now I've got the good sense to check those thoughts and check them out and not just take them at face value. But these prejudices come from a lifetime of growing up around certain attitudes and certain opinions. And one of the most truly dramatic examples of my adult life, what happened to me not long after I entered seminary to become a minister. I was attending a chapel service at Harvard Divinity School, one of my first. This was 1997, and one of the speakers who came to the podium was transgender. I consider myself a very progressive and open-minded guy. The speaker, she was dressed like a man typically dresses in our society and had a full beard. Her name was female. Her voice was high-pitched, and she referred to herself with female pronouns. Now, you can believe I didn't say anything out loud, but what I was thinking was, this is really messed up. Who is this person? What is wrong with her? And what's wrong with the seminary to let such a person come in to become a minister? I was even thinking, this is what's wrong with our country. Now, outwardly, I was trying to look accepting and act very polite. I had a reputation to uphold. While inwardly, I was an uncomfortable stew of judgment and self-righteousness. Probably my saving grace at that point was that my need to look accepting and liberal-minded was greater than my desire to express my disapproval. What this did was that it compelled me to pretend to be okay with the situation publicly while I sorted out my true feelings privately. Now, to make a longer story shorter, the sheer dignity and compassion and humanity of this person soon won me over. She was kind, she was thoughtful and courageous and humble and exuded an incredible amount of self-confidence. And as I came to know her in the months and the years that followed, I could not help but respect her and honor her as a person and as well as a colleague. Now, you have to understand, nobody is more surprised about this, or was, than me. And one day she surprised me and she flattered me by saying that she needed a strong man to help her to move a desk that somebody was giving her into her office at school. And so I said, well, sure, of course, I would love to help you out. And we got into her car and drove off. And I need to tell you that when we left campus, we went on to a working class neighborhood in Boston to where this desk was being held. And when we stepped out of that car, I have to tell you, for the first time, I realized I was scared for my life. I was walking through an alleyway with this person who, in the eyes of our culture, could be considered a freak, a pervert, or queer in working class Boston. And I figured to the onlookers, I was guilty by association. Who was I? Her boyfriend, her friend, her brother? Now, I knew people carried these attitudes because at first glance, that's what I thought. And I consider myself to be a very open-minded person. Needless to say, the short distance from her car to the office where we were picking up this desk felt like forever. And I was truly afraid that we were both going to be jumped and beaten in a hate crime. Very well could have happened, but I realized when we made it inside and made it back without an altercation, how relieved I was. Some of the facial expressions of onlookers felt like arrows and darts, and I remember feeling intimidated and very vulnerable. And as we drove the 10 miles back to campus, I found myself looking over at the speedometer to make sure she wasn't speeding, because I was afraid we might get pulled over by a tough Boston cop who would see her face and then look at her driver's license, and I didn't know what could happen. Now, I think that was mostly due to the post-traumatic stress of being in the alley a little bit earlier. But I realize now that my new friend and colleague lives with this. I realized then that she lives with that fear and intimidation and sense of vulnerability every day and every night of her life. That experience stirred something in me. I made a commitment to myself to try to understand and undo my own prejudices, and to use whatever power and privilege I have to help other people to look at and examine and hold up their prejudices. But also knowing that my influence is not great in changing people's opinions, I committed to becoming an advocate for laws and policies that protect transgender persons and other people in our society who are in danger because of other people's prejudices and judgments and self-righteousness. Now, the reason that I bring this up at all this morning is that as I thought about Lincoln and the others, I realized that here at All Souls, we have to make room for each other, for all of us, wherever we are on this journey of acceptance and of understanding. What I mean to say is that we have a beautiful vision of the world we hope to someday help to create, and a beautiful vision for what an inclusive church where everybody feels welcome will look like. A place where all souls can be welcome. But we cannot expect ourselves or each other to be on the same place on that journey. And our values, just like everything else in this amazing existence, are evolving. And we all have our prejudices, our self-righteousnesses, and our arrogances. To me, what it means is that to be an inclusive church, to be an open-minded person, means that we need to make room for everyone, wherever they are, on their journey in life, and not expect everybody to just walk into this church with total acceptance of all differences. Now, if our church was only going to welcome those people who come in who are already accepting of everybody, we're going to have a really small church whose work is done because we've all arrived. Instead, let us take a lesson from these great men and women of history like Lincoln and remember that we are all products of our times, all products of our culture, but we are not confined by our times and our culture. Let us seek to make our hearts big enough for the love of all people, and to make our church a place where our hearts can grow in love. Now, the question we must ask each other is not, have you arrived? But are you willing to be on the journey towards wholeness and love beyond belief? Now, it's interesting to note that at the recent inaugural, in the speech and the list of people and places where the most evident truths of our nation were declared, that all of us are created equal, it references in the speech Seneca Falls, Selma, and Stonewall. Now, I mentioned Seneca Falls, the women's conference for women's suffrage in 1848. Selma, we all know the civil rights marches and what happened there during the civil rights movement, but not everybody knows the last one. Stonewall is the name of a bar in Greenwich Village, New York, where in 1969, riotous resistance to a police raid spawned the modern-day gay rights movement. The ones who led the resistance were the transgender people who were there. If it weren't for their courage and their defiance that night, we might not have a very strong gay rights movement in this country right now. They said, we're going to stand up to the police no matter what happens, and we're going to stop this kind of abuse. So it's interesting that sometimes in the gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender movement, the G, L, and the B aren't always as accepting of the T, but the T, the transgender community, are the ones who had the courage and the defiance to spark the whole movement. And so I hope that they can always be accepted. I have learned so much about courage from the transgender people in this community and in my life. Now, I want to end with this final story and thought. In Frederick Douglass's narrative of his escape from slavery, he moved to Bedford, Massachusetts, and he says wonderful things about Bedford and how he was treated and accepted and the way that blacks and whites were living together and their kids were going to school together, and he had a lot of compliments, but he said there were still some things that were not equal, and he recounts that the Lyceum, which was the public lecture hall that did not allow black people to attend the lectures of the day. Now, keep in mind that this was before television and before the internet, so these lectures were a major source of information as well as entertainment. And in his book, he explains that certain people refused, at risk to themselves and their reputation and their income, to lecture at the New Bedford Lyceum until they let everybody attend, black and white. And he names 4 people in his book. He names those who refused to speak were Ralph Waldo Emerson, Theodore Parker, Henry David Thoreau, and Horace Greeley, 3 Unitarians and a Universalist. Their simple protest eventually changed the Lyceum and allowed everybody to come in. And it reminds me that making an impact for freedom and justice and truth does not require writing a book. It doesn't require becoming president of the United States. It doesn't require discovering a theory of how we were all created. It's also, and more commonly, comes from courageous people who are willing to take a risk, sacrifice a little bit of money, maybe accept a little bit of ridicule from the society by standing up for what they know in their heart of hearts is right. From Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall, from one soul to all souls. As the president said recently, for history tells us that while these truths may be self-evident, they have never been self-executing. That while freedom is a gift from God, it must be secured by His people here on earth. Cenk Jones ends his article with this thought: occasionally, far too occasionally, the right person shows up at the exact moment in time when needed the most. And so I ask you this morning, how are you showing up? Are you hiding behind a laundry list of excuses about why you're not the right person? Why your life circumstances Put you in a place where you can't be all of who you're meant to be? Or are you willing to admit that you're just like the rest of us? You are an evolving human being on a journey towards wholeness and discovery. In the words of another great president, with a good conscience, our only sure reward. With history, the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking God's blessing and God's help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. Amen. And because we're together and we're all souls, I'd like to just take this opportunity to just relish in some joy that I've been feeling throughout the week as I've read all these things and done this research, that I was amazed to learn for the first time that, number one, Theodore Parker, the Unitarian minister in Massachusetts, he's the first one who wrote the line, government of the people, by the people, for the people, which then Lincoln borrowed from him, had heard from him, and used in the Gettysburg Address. And then I learned as well, as we looked into the Battle Hymn of the Republic, that it was a Unitarian woman who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, words which Martin Luther King used prominently in his speeches in the very last public words that he spoke. To see how influential our very literary and very progressive faith tradition has influenced and infiltrated the culture of America and helped to shape it towards being a freer, more equitable place, more just. It makes me very proud. And I know we come from a very somewhat radical band of religious free thinkers. And I think we can do even more in our times to continue that tradition. And I give thanks for all the ways that you allow me and Tamara and Gerald and Barbara and the rest of us as ministers to do that in our community. Go and be blessed and be a blessing. Amen.